Thank you all for coming this evening. We've got two fantastic speakers. To start with, we've got Nik Jovčić-Sas, who did a BA in theology at King's College London. He's a blogger, kind of Orthodox Serbian theologian, LGBT rights activist, busker. He recently published a chapter in an edited volume, New Approaches, the History of Theology to Same-Sex Love and Desire. And I'll let you take it from here.
Brilliant. Thank you. So, it's really wonderful to be here today. This is the first time I've given this chapter as such a short talk. So, I've edited a lot of things out, and hopefully it will make sense. But obviously, if you've got any questions, we have a little bit of time at the end, and we can clear up anything that I haven't quite gone over in my talk. So, Serbia is a country with a reputation for extreme violent homophobia. It began when the country's first Pride March in Belgrade ended with thousands of violent anti-LGBT protesters attacking the event and leaving many hospitalized. When a second Pride was attempted in 2010, anti-LGBT protesters came armed with bricks and Molotov cocktails. Though there's been a renewed determination by the government in Serbia to try and change that reputation to conform to EU membership standards, the effects of this policy changes has been minimal, and LGBT activists in the country have criticised them as just pinkwashing. The reality for LGBT people in Serbia is pretty bleak. Attacks against, violent attacks are still very common. Hate crimes are very badly policed, and rates of suicidal thoughts and very severe mental health issues are extremely high. The LGBT community finds itself sort of trapped in a bit of a tug of war. There are many people in Serbia who wish to see the benefits of European Union membership, but there are also very significant actors within the country that see the EU's LGBT plus agenda as a threat to Serbia. And foremost amongst them is the Serbian Orthodox Church. In the past 30 years, the Church has risen to become one of the most powerful institutions in Serbian society. That's because of a mixture of post-socialist desecularization and an ongoing sort of ethno-religious tensions in Kosovo, which has elevated the national mythology born in that region, which portrays Serbs as a sort of Orthodox Christian warrior nation. The Church has invested much of that new power that it's gained into attacking the LGBT community. Members of its clergy stood side by side with those who hospitalized peaceful protesters in its first Pride marches in 2001 and 2010. They've lobbied the government with disturbing success to block protections against minorities, and on numerous occasions they've also called for violence against the LGBT community. Their teaching on the subject of same-sex relationships can be sort of broken into three major themes that sort of just get reiterated. The first is that homosexuality is a mental illness. The second is that same-sex relationships are not native to Serbia and they have no place in the country's Christian traditions. And the third is that violent intolerance towards those with same-sex orientations is normal and an inherent part of Serbian Orthodox Christianity. So in today's lecture, I want to give you like a condensed version of the chapter presented in New Approaches in History and Theology to Same-Sex Love and Desire, and basically offer a critique to the current teaching of the Serbian Orthodox Church. In the next few minutes, we're going to basically go on a little journey through the history of Serbia from independence at the beginning of the 19th century, where they liberated themselves from the Ottoman Empire, to the present day, and look how shifting spheres of influence have changed the way people see sexuality in the country. And in particular, I want to focus on the nature and decline of the ancient Orthodox Christian practice of Brotherhood unions, known in Serbian as Pobratimstvo, which Yale historian John Boswell claims to be a form of same-sex marriage practiced in the Eastern Orthodox Church. In exploring this history, I want to show you how intolerance towards same-sex relationships is not something inherent within Serbian Orthodoxy, but rather a result of an ongoing struggle to assert national identity in Europe through the creation of sexual borders. My aim is also to show that same-sex relationships have played an important role in my country's past, and as such should play an important role in its future and within the Serbian Orthodox Church. So, in the past 500 years, there's actually only ever been two independent Serbian states. The first one is the current Republic of Serbia that came about in 2006. And the first of those was the Kingdom of Serbia, which was created after various uprisings against the Ottoman Empire in 1882. It was this period that was really like the crucible in which the foundations of sort of like modern Serbian nationalism sort of came about. And so it's a really important time period to understand how Serbia sees itself and issues of sexuality in the world today. And life for Serbs in the Ottoman Empire was significantly different from sort of Western European Christian counterparts. Firstly, they lived in a very different cultural sphere. As a response to growing colonial power in the imperial Western Europe in the 18th and 19th century, the Ottomans had pursued a policy of isolationism, which not only led to their eventual demise in many ways, but it also created a very distinct divide in between the culture that you saw in Western Europe and in the southeastern part of the continent. And Turkish culture can still be seen as very prevalent in Serbia today, much to people's protest, and it can be seen in everything from language to food and music and so on. Secondly, the Ottoman occupied Balkans, in which most Serbs lived, had a very different attitude towards sexuality and relationships. In the 19th century, Western Europe was increasingly obsessed with the repression of certain expressions of sexual identity. Michel Foucault addresses this at length in his work, particularly the way in which sexuality was increasingly seen in scientific terms and certain forms of sexual gender expression, from masturbation to any infraction of gender norms, were viewed as a form of mental illness. In this period, Western imperial powers increasingly came to police their subjects' sexuality. I have a quote by the anthropologist Alexandra Horvath, who writes, "The idea of individual and racial progress overall was based not only on the development of reason, but on the repression of sexual instinct. That is, the repression of one's immediate instinctive reaction was the essential mechanism of evolutionary process in both intellectual and moral sphere. The analogy was simple. Those who could control their own internal natural impulses were believed to be more capable of controlling the forces outside of them. In other words, the sexuality that fit with the Victorian bourgeois values were a significant benchmark of what was civilized, and any deviation from it was represented as uncivilized or even as savage." In stark contrast, in the Ottoman Empire, they really cared very little for the sexual lives of the subjects who lived within it. As a result, the Balkans became home to a kaleidoscope of different sexual and romantic traditions, from polygamy, monogamy, and celibate monasteries and harems might be found to exist even within the walls of a single city. Though individual religious groups had some authority on this matter, the ultimate hegemonic supremacy of the Sultan allowed for freedom of expression that you didn't see in Western Europe, particularly in regards to same-sex relationships. The Ottoman historian Druzevi wrote that Ottoman sexuality was male-oriented, pleasure-bound, and generally unrestricted by religious beliefs. And this culture led to much social and sexual interaction, including same-sex, between Muslims, Christians, and Jews. So enticing was the Ottomans' liberal attitudes towards same-sex relationships that Western Europeans even travelled to southeastern Europe in order to experience this culture. Most notable among them is probably Lord Byron, who wrote of his time in a bathhouse in modern-day Thessaloniki in Greece as a marble paradise of sherbet and sodomy. In recent years, there's been increasing scholarship about how queer history about queer history in former Ottoman countries, and particularly this sort of like liberalism towards different sort of sexual mores. But very little has actually been written about countries such as Serbia in this period. In Same-Sex Unions in Premodern Europe, the queer church historian John Boswell claimed that the prevalent practice of brotherhood and sisterhood unions, which was popular in Orthodox Christian countries, communities rather, in the 19th century Balkans, fulfilled what most people today regard as the essence of same-sex marriage, a permanent romantic commitment between two people witnessed and recognized by the community. In his book, which contains a number of original liturgies for the creation of the ceremony, two originate from 19th century Serbia. Though Boswell's work has been very heavily critiqued, my own research into the practice of brotherhood unions in Serbia during this period have yielded some sort of interesting results and show a more tolerant side to Serbian Orthodox Christianity. So the practice of brotherhood unions can be traced in the Balkans back to the 5th century, and the Serbian historian Pantelj Srećković, who was not only from the 9th century, but was the source of the brotherhood liturgies used by Boswell, wrote that in the 19th century, these sorts of unions were practiced from Thessaloniki to Istria, from the Adriatic shores to beyond the Danube and Sava rivers, everywhere where Serbian is spoken. Today, they've been mainly lost from Serbs' collective memory. For those who are aware of them, they see them mainly as a military union between two male soldiers. And that is corroborated by numerous sources. It was believed that men who were bonded together in this way would make better warriors. The British ethnographer Mary Edith Durham recorded one of the duties of these sworn brothers. When two Pobratimts went to war, it was said that it was the duty of one to cut off and carry away the head of the other, if slain, to prevent it falling into the hands of the enemy. So it was this very sort of gruff, military-based unions in many ways. But obviously that sort of military sound to it doesn't actually preclude it from also being something, a form of same-sex desire. The liturgies I mentioned recorded by Srećković, which he collected them, but they dated back to around the 14th century, follow an order that is quite similar to the Orthodox marriage rite. First, the couples are processed by the priests into the centre of the church. They're given white candles. They then perform a rite known as the common cup, in which the couple take communion together. They then do the dance of Isaiah, which is where they process around the table 3 times, and they end the service with a kiss. In some liturgies also they have, I don't know how many people here are familiar with the Orthodox wedding rite, but in different ceremonies sometimes they have the placing of crowns, which is a very significant part of Orthodox marriage. Many of these liturgical acts I've just mentioned are really exclusive to the rite of marriage in Orthodoxy. Such is the language as well. The liturgies also includes the recitation of 1 Corinthians 13, which many people are familiar as something used within marriage. And Boswell wrote that this connection between the two sorts of rites would have been very evident to those who witnessed one of these services taking place. He writes, "The most striking parallels have to do with visual symbolism, which was certainly more memorable for the congregation. The couple standing hand in hand at the altar, being joined and blessed by priests, would last longer in the imagination and memory than the precise wording of any ceremony." But in my opinion, what's even more compelling are the accounts that you get, particularly from ethnographers who are traveling in the region, especially in the 19th century and the early 20th century, and what they observed from these unions. The German historian Leopold von Ranke, in his 1853 History of Serbia and the Serbian Revolution, wrote of Pobratimstvo that persons unite with one another in the name of God and St. John for mutual fidelity and aid during their whole lives. A man, it is considered, will make the safest selection for his brother, in choosing one who he may at some time have dreamed that he solicited assistance in some case of need. Gorovic writes in his personal experience of these unions in 1917 that he described them as tender and touching, and that they bring bonds not only between individuals but also extended families, and wrote that a brotherhood union could be seen as something which could obstruct the potential for marriage. Other accounts show actually a more sexual side also to these brotherhood unions. Mary Edith Duran, who inquired into this tradition at a time when Western social norms were becoming more prevalent in the Balkans, and when these unions had begun to decline, gave this account. My old friend, a priest, spoke in the strongest terms against this ceremony, which he said should never have been permitted. He described it as a marriage of two men against all nature, and intimated clearly that, as did others, that it had been a cloak for vice. Paul Nacker, a German anthropologist, observed brotherhood rituals amongst Orthodox Christians in neighbouring Albania. He described these unions as stark sexual, strongly sexual, and he notes that oral and anal sex were prohibited as they were seen as too Turkish, and that these Christians preferred interfemoral sex, and that was seen as somewhat more de rigueur. He also commented on how he saw these unions very common to Balkan Greek ideas as the sacred band of Thebes, or might be more familiar with the way that Spartans often had same-sex relationships, because they believed it sort of built stronger connections in the battlefield. Whether this constitutes something that is equivalent to an Orthodox marriage is a question that's a bit too sort of broad to go into a lot of detail right now. But what I will say is that for those who performed this union and entered it, that they saw it something that was not contrary to their Orthodox Christian faith. And that might be because they saw that there was an important distinction between this loving relationship, which they saw as a very important Christian value to them, and saw sexual acts as something that was more personal, and that there was a differentiation between these two different things. However, with the sort of coming of the 19th century, the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, and increase of Western influence in Serbia, this sort of attitude would very quickly change. So I also have this little picture here. I didn't know when I was going to do it. I'll do it now. So these are two wedding dresses from Serbia. One's from the early 19th century and one's from the early 20th century. And I think they really nicely portray the way that Serbia then came to change very distinctly in between those Ottoman periods and post-Ottoman periods, in the way that they saw love and relationships, and the way they want to portray their culture. They're both from the region of Belgrade. On this one here, which is very lovely, it has like a peacock feather headdress, which is supposed to scare away evil spirits which could attack you during a wedding. It has coins around the necklace because that was part of the dowry, which was a very important part of the arranged Serbian marriages that happened in the Ottoman period. You have this sort of cloak and very sort of beautiful embroidery. The second one is something that you could really see anywhere in the rest of Europe at the same period. It's white lace, not pictured, is a really fabulous like white lace umbrella that goes with it, and some lovely white lace gloves. And it shows how Serbia would come to really start to portray itself more like a Western European nation. So towards the end of the 19th century, attitudes towards sexuality began to change, and this was prompted by the decline of the Ottomans across Southeastern Europe, as well as the increased access of Western Europeans in the region. Western Europeans held that the Ottomans were morally inferior and deviant, and that the empire's downfall was a result of their, in some ways, a result of their uncivilized desires. Aware of this perception, Ottoman elites began to dismember older sexual discourses in order to surpass Western morality on its own terms. That's why you see, for example, a country like Turkey, which, as we've mentioned, was had a very liberal attitude towards sexuality. Today, Erdogan says that homosexual relationships have no place in Turkey because they have no place in Turkish tradition. You have that sort of strange dissonance there. And yes, so there was the complete loss of very old Ottoman practices, from the harem to polygamous relationships and homoerotic themes within the arts. Anthropologist Matthew Bunzel writes that in the late 19th century, Balkans and Eastern Europe, the nationality struggle may have been fought in part through competing models of sexual objection. New countries in the region sought to conform to Western standards as a mark of civilization and attempted to repress any traditional expressions of sexuality or gender that might be seen as deviant. Serbia's new aristocratic urban elite, the kind of people who might wear this lovely white lace dress, attempted to westernize the country through emulating bourgeois society, and in doing so applied the understanding of sexual deviancy to their own culture. Serbia's first law code, decreed by the revolutionary leader Karađorđe in 1809, didn't mention anything about same-sex relationships or make any prohibition to same-sex sexual acts. But in 1860, the second law code by Miloš Obrenović prohibited same-sex sexual acts, which carried a maximum penalty of 15 years imprisonment. Despite these reforms, Serbs were very much regarded as other across the rest of the continent. Alexandre de Grande, the French consul in 1893, described the region in these terms. It's not anymore the Orient, but it's not the West either. It's in the process of transformation. Serbia was also in many ways regarded as Turkey in Europe, and portrayals of the Balkan region were distinctly Orientalist. The British Westminster Gazette newspaper in 1908 published a series on the region where it referred to the Balkans as savage Europe. And popular literature like Bram Stoker's Dracula played into stereotypes of the region as being filled with stupid, superstitious peasants and villainous, lustful elites. Sexualized bodies then became an issue of national honor for Serbs, and who were consistently portrayed as an inferior and often lustful nation. And that's something that Serbian elites tried to rigorously police, using this sort of the new Western taxonomy that had sort of become popular. Taking into account the prominence of Western discourse, it's my opinion that Pobratimstvo, these brotherhood unions, is specifically tied to the advent of homosexuality, which came about in 1892. It represented a perception change in same-sex relationships. David Halperin argued that homosexuality was unique in its comparison to previous aphorisms, as it isolated sexual acts from the cultural phenomenon in which they had existed. The majority of antecedent terms describing same-sex relationships had created certain cultural distinctions, i.e. the ages of persons involved, or active or passive, or maybe in this case the faith of people involved. Homosexuality obliterated such boundaries and placed all forms of same-sex relationships under a single category, offering a method by which it was possible to discern who is a homosexual through positive, ascertainable and objective behavioural phenomena. Pobratimstvo had a number of qualities that had made it an acceptable form of same-sex relationship within Serbian culture, particularly in the way that it emphasised Orthodox spiritual friendship and the Serbian warrior culture that was so elevated by the sort of Kosovo mythology that we see in Serbia. However, under the gaze of scientia sexualis, all sexual acts or expressions of romantic love between men were symptoms of the new illness of homosexuality. Seeking to distance themselves from these uncivilized behaviours, Serbs began to view homosexuality as a foreign sickness. A Belgrade psychiatrist in the early 20th century theorized that the Turkish conquerors had spread this illness among the people. Pobratimstvo in turn became an unwanted mark of otherness and slowly vanished from society. Mary Edith wrote, "I was often assured that the custom was extinct and I never came across a case, but it possibly still lingered in out-of-the-way places. People who wished to appear civilized in Montenegro were very apt to deny the existence of customs they thought would be despised, but it was admitted that Pobratimstvo had only recently died out. Medakovic in 1860 mentions it as prevalent." So, just to conclude. So this is what pop music looks like in one of Europe's most homophobic countries. Not homoerotic in the slightest. The Metropolitan Callistos wrote on tradition that not everything received in the past is of equal value. Indeed, one of the chief works of the Church over the past 2,000 years has been to consider the authenticity and authority of the traditions being handed down to them. The changing attitudes towards Pobratimstvo reveal a questionable and rather new tradition in Serbian Orthodoxy, one which is wholly intolerant to any form of love or desire between men, and scrutinizes individuals under a psychiatric pseudoscience of the 19th century Western Europe. This development is not unique to Serbia, but rather a process of broader westernization seen across the Balkan region after the fall of the Ottoman Empire. Nevertheless, the history of Brotherhood unions draws the value and authority of this supposed tradition of homophobia into question. Even if we choose not to accept Boswell's thesis that Pobratimstvo constitutes a form of gay marriage, it's clear that these relationships were much more than something purely platonic or political. The history of Brotherhood unions in the Serbian Orthodox Church shows a plurality and tolerance that undermines the use of tradition as a justification for the current atmosphere of violent discrimination. More than that, I would argue that Pobratimstvo is a celebration of several fundamental aspects of Serbian Orthodox culture and identity. Their preservation from the first millennia into the 20th century is a testament to the unique Byzantine character of Serbian Orthodox Christianity. The clash of ideologies between far-right Serbian nationalists and the European Union have made the issues of sexuality and nationalism in Serbia as closely intertwined today as they were in the 19th and 20th centuries. The Church's role in this conflict has been more important than ever, and yet the reactionary nature of its response to LGBTQ+ rights has made reasonable dialogue on the issue of same-sex relationships impossible. This has been further reinforced by the Serbian Church's close relationship with far-right nationalist groups that have elevated the Church. We must remember, however, that nationalism isn't the primary purpose of national churches such as the Serbian Orthodox Church, and that Orthodox Christians shouldn't allow their sort of misguided patriotism to obscure their history. Otherwise, they risk forfeiting their claim to authority and disfiguring the traditions handed down to us by God through Jesus Christ and his bride